Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Leslie, for such a generous introduction. It's a little daunting to live up to. I also want to thank everyone who was involved in and had anything to do with inviting me to this gorgeous location, to this conference that I've heard so much about over the years. I want to give a special shout out to James McKenzie, who and the rest of the program committee, for inviting me, for taking care of sort of all the logistics and the nitty-gritty of getting here and getting my slides and just all of the stuff that make it easy to give a talk like this, or easier. And I want to especially thank them for answering a whole bunch of questions that I had, right? So when I'm asked to speak at a conference, I try to remember to respond to the question of will you speak at our conference with a set of my own questions. So I ask, do you have a code of conduct? I ask, do you have scholarships or some other way so that people who might not otherwise be able to attend your conference could attend? And I ask, are you making efforts to ensure diversity in attendance at your conference and in the speaker lineup and panelists and presenters? And the answer to all three of those was a resounding yes from Access 2016, so great job, really, very impressive. And then, of course, New Brunswick earned bonus points on my sort of secret private criteria, which is this conference in an interesting and beautiful place that I've never been, right? So when this slide first went up, Leslie said, oh, I want to go there. I took this last night on a walk along the river outside the hotel. So she has been there. It really is a beautiful, thank you for the beautiful location too. So, and again, it was just a no-brainer to say yes to this, and thank you for having me here and having a chance to talk with all of you. So this is my standard please tweet this talk slide. So I do hope those of you who are so inclined will tweet, and we can finish the conversation, continue the conversation in that medium. I have not yet figured out how to live tweet my own talk, so I'll join you there at the end. I also want to say that I'm really glad that Dr. McLean acknowledged that the land on which we're gathered is traditional unceded territory. That's the importance of acknowledging that we work on lands that are the traditional territories of First Nations people is something I'm learning from my Canadian colleagues and from my Native American colleagues. It is, I think, a really much needed way of showing recognition and respect for Aboriginal peoples and First Nations peoples. And I will say, though, that it is not a practice that has caught on widely in the U.S. yet. But there is some movement in the U.S. Among colleges and universities to wrestle with their own pasts, to acknowledge the role of slavery, for example, and the mistreatment of Native Americans in their founding and their early success. So you may have seen in the news fairly recently, there are dozens of American universities, Harvard, Brown, Columbia University, Georgetown, the University of Virginia, that are in the process of sort of investigating and publicly acknowledging their ties to slavery, including their dependence on slave labor. And these schools are beginning the hard work of trying to find paths to restitution. And I mention that because it's not unrelated to the topic of my talk, right? If I recall correctly, and Leslie set it up nicely, in this talk, in the abstract for the talk, I assert that libraries aren't neutral, that technology isn't neutral, and that we can and should leverage both in the service of social justice. So I figured I should spend a little bit of time unpacking that claim that neither libraries nor technologies are neutral. And one place to start for academic libraries, at least, is to look at our parent institutions and to acknowledge that they are not and never have been neutral. Now, I have to, speaking of biases, my point of reference is very much the U.S. context. But I suspect, and I hope that you'll talk to us about it when I'm done here, that the context rings true in Canada as well. So as I said, American colleges were originally built as exclusive institutions for well-connected and generally wealthy white men. And in many cases, American universities were literally built on the backs of enslaved African Americans. Many of our institutions in the U.S. were built on land taken from Native Americans, and almost all of our colleges and universities excluded in practice, if not also in policy, women, non-white men, queer people, and other marginalized populations. So we start from these histories of exploitation, of appropriation, of enslavement, and of displacement. And I believe that we have a responsibility to acknowledge that we give our labor to institutions with these troubled histories. And even acknowledging that is a political act. But not acknowledging it is a political act too. To me, there's no neutral here. Then to bring this into a current context, I think it's important to give credit to students, predominantly students of color in the U.S., who came together on our campuses last fall and who continue to come together to demand that universities own up to the systemic racism that exists in higher education. So we take steps to reduce discrimination and promote social justice. Many of you probably heard about the very highly visible student protest at places like the University of Missouri and at Yale University. But in truth, there were students and community members at hundreds of colleges across the U.S. that took up the call and protested and demanded action from their own schools. For example, at MIT and again at colleges across the U.S., students have called our attention to ubiquitous and blatant instances of racist and sexist behavior. They've demanded that we hire more faculty and staff from underrepresented groups, and they've called for faculty and staff to be educated on unconscious bias. In short, they've basically said it's not enough to welcome students from marginalized groups to our campuses with words and policies. We need you to take concrete action to create welcoming, inclusive, and integrated communities. And in some cases, they've called on us to leverage the academy and its resources to address societal level failings. All right, so that's all big and broad. What does it mean for us? Well, that's what I want to talk about today. As folks who work in and around library technologies, how can we leverage our work in the service of social justice? Well, first we should probably define social justice. So I'm going to cheat a bit with the answer and of what social justice is and what it might look like by citing myself and some wonderful co-authors. So in an article titled Diversity, Social Justice, and the Future of Libraries that I had the honor of writing with Myrna Morales and M. Claire Knowles, we define social justice as the ability of all people to fully benefit from economic and social progress and to participate equally in democratic societies. Now, if you believe, like I do, that equitable access to information and the tools to discover, use, and understand that information is a core enabling feature of a truly democratic society, then it's easy to see that libraries are crucial to social justice. So what would a social justice agenda look like in a library? Well, again, I'll quote myself. Several months ago, I gave a joint keynote with a colleague, Larice Hall, who, by the way, is now Dean of Libraries at the very prestigious Rhode Island School of Design. We miss her at MIT, but it's great to have her as a colleague there. So we gave a joint keynote where we sort of just asked each other a set of questions, and she asked me what a queer feminist agenda for libraries might look like. And I think the answer stands for a general social justice agenda as well. And what I said was, and I'll quote myself, a feminist and queer agenda in an academic library would be one where the collections and services are not centered on the experiences of cis, straight, white, Western men, where the people who work in the library truly do reflect the diversity of our communities, where the staff and patrons are empowered and where the tools, systems, and policies are transparent and inclusive. And I have my Rubio moment here. So for this crowd and at this conference, let's talk about the tools and the technologies piece. And the first thing I want to do is run through a whole set of examples just to really illustrate what I mean when I say that technology is not neutral. I'm hoping here to convince any skeptics among us that the technology is often biased. So the first thing we have to do is, of course, start with search technologies and search tools. And I hope that most librarians will agree that commercial search engines are not neutral in the sense that commercial interest in promoted content can and do impact relevancy. But of course, declaring one thing as more relevant than another is always based on some subjective judgment, even if that judgment is coded into an algorithm many steps away from the output. Or, as my dear colleague Beth Sadler says, the idea of neutral relevance is an oxymoron. And of course, you can't talk about bias in search tools without talking about the fantastic work of one of my library sheroes, Safiya Noble. So hopefully some of you are familiar with her work. And in her work, Safiya Noble demonstrates how the non-neutrality of commercial search engines reinforces and perpetuates stereotypes, despite the fact that many of the users of Google and other search tools assume that the algorithm is neutral. And what her analysis of Google shows us is that the algorithm reinforces, for example, the sexualization of women, especially Black and Latina women. So because of Google's sort of neutral, relevant reliance on popularity, page rank, and promoted content, the results for searches for information on Black girls or Latina girls are dominated by links to pornography and other sexualized content. And she suggests, and I echo it here because I'm not about to show the results from the podium, that users go ahead and try Google searches on every variation you can think of for women's and girls' identities, and you'll see many of the ways in which commercial interests have subverted a diverse and realistic range of representations. So again, I'm not going to show you those results. I encourage those of you who might be skeptical to do some of those searches for yourself. Search for Asian girls, or Latina girls, or Black girls, or Native girls. And then imagine being a girl or a woman of color looking for yourself and your community on the web. Or just imagine you're a tech worker. We know that the stereotype of tech worker is male, nerdy, and white. And the Google image search verifies and reinforces that. And here I want to emphasize that labels and words matter. And this slide I call a tale of two searches. Just look at the different images you get when you search for librarian versus information scientist. Now, we all like to think that library search tools can do better. And I believe they can, I absolutely do. But only when we're intentional about it. So let me talk about another kind of technology that isn't neutral. And that comes from cameras and photo editing software. So photographer Sarita McFadden has written extensively about how color film and other photographic technologies were developed around trying to measure images against white skin. The default settings for everything from film stock to lighting to shutter speed were and continue to be designed to best capture normal faces. And those normal faces are white. What that means is that it's difficult to take photos of non-white faces that are accurately rendered without doing a whole bunch of post-image adjustments that sacrifice sort of the sharpness and the glossiness that is readily apparent and kind of automatic in photos of white faces. After this article came out, Twitter and other social media was full of pictures of especially interracial couples sort of declaring, no wonder we can never get good pictures of both of us. So it's really important work that she did here to sort of deconstruct those technologies. So another example, how many of you have heard about the Twitter bot that Microsoft created that became a crazy, racist, sexist idiot in less than 24 hours? So for those of you who haven't, last spring Microsoft unveiled a Twitter bot named Tay, and it was programmed to tweet like a teen. I mean, what could go wrong, right? I mean, you know. So Tay is backed by artificial intelligence algorithms that were supposed to help the bot learn how to converse naturally on Twitter. But of course, what happened is that the bot learned quickly from the worst corners of Twitter. And within 24 hours, Microsoft had to shut the experiment down because the bot had started tweeting all kinds of sexist, racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic garbage. And again, you can use your Google skills to find some examples of some of the most hideous stuff that Tay tweeted. I'm not going to share that from here. But for me, the Microsoft experiment with this machine learning Twitter bot is such a stark example of the fact that passive mythical neutrality is anything but neutral, right? And sure, you can blame Tay's failure on the racist creeps on Twitter, but creating technology that fails to anticipate the racist and sexist ways that technology might be used and exploited is not a neutral act. And I'm going to go as far to guess that it was a choice made by people who are least likely to have been targets of some of the discriminatory crap that happens on the internet. So my bigger point here is more about crowdsourcing and leveraging the social web, right? These are hot trends in tech right now, and I want to encourage us to think hard and critically about the consequences on relying on the social web and relying on crowdsourcing. Basically, I think we need to be very aware of the fact that if we crowdsource something, or if we rely on the social web or the sharing economy, we have to at least try to correct for the fact that the crowd is racist and sexist and homophobic and discriminatory in a whole bunch of horrifying ways. So there are all these great new services, part of what we call the sharing economy, that eliminate the middleman, right? How many of you used Airbnb for this trip, or have used it? Anybody used Uber or Lyft? Right, so you guys know these are the sharing economy is about services that let people share services, to share things like rides and rooms with strangers. Now, stories abound in the US context of, for example, Uber and Lyft drivers refusing to pick up passengers in minority neighborhoods, or canceling rides when they learn that a passenger is disabled and might require some accommodation or assistance. But the case I find really interesting is the Airbnb case, right? Because they're trying to fix their racism problem with both policy and technology. So here's what happened with Airbnb. First, about a year ago, there was an experimental study out of Harvard showing that renters were less likely to rent to people with black-sounding names. Then there were a bunch of reports from renters where hosts had canceled bookings for black guests only to then rent to white guests for the same time period. And honestly, this shouldn't surprise us, right? The amount of social science evidence confirming that people act in biased ways in a huge variety of settings is overwhelming. But what's interesting about this case is that Airbnb is trying to do something about it, and they're being unusually transparent about it. So it's my hope that we can learn in some things that work and some things that maybe don't work so well by watching what they do. So first, they're having everyone who participates as either a renter or a host sign a community agreement that they'll treat everyone with respect and without bias. It's sort of an Airbnb code of conduct. And there is some evidence that community compacts introduce a little bit of mutual accountability and have positive effects, so that's a good start. They're also providing training on unconscious bias to hosts, and then they're highlighting hosts that complete the training on their website. So this is a decidedly not neutral way of driving more renters to the host who complete unconscious bias training. So this is a leveraging of sort of policy and technology altogether, right? They're also working on some technical features to eliminate instances where hosts claim a room or a house is booked when a black renter makes a request, only to then immediately rent for the same time period to a white renter. And here's how they explain this feature. So with the new feature, if a host rejects a guest by stating that their space is not available, Airbnb will automatically block the calendar for subsequent reservation requests for that same time period. It seems like such a simple technology intervention, but it really sort of cuts off the possibility and technically of people acting in these racist ways. They're also adding new flagging tools so people can report discrimination and hate speech more easily. And they tell us that they have a whole team of engineers, data scientists, and designers who are looking for other ways to mitigate discrimination and bake some anti-bias features into their platform. Now, I've actually never used Airbnb, so I'm not touting them as, I'm not a spokesperson. And I will say that, of course, it would have been better if they had anticipated the racist behavior enabled by their platform, of course. But now that they're trying to make corrections and to use technology to do it, I think there's a real opportunity for all of us to learn how we might leverage technology in combating discrimination. Okay. So hopefully I've convinced you that technology is not neutral. It doesn't exist as neutral artifacts or tools. This isn't about the fact that technology can sometimes get used in oppressive and exclusionary ways, but rather that technology itself has baked-in biases that perpetuate existing inequalities and exclusions and that reinforce stereotypes. Okay, so what do we do? How do we not just try to mitigate the bias, but actually bring a social justice mindset to our work in library technology? How do we promote an inclusive perspective and an agenda of equity in and through our tech work? Well, the first obvious answer for me is that we do everything we can to make sure the teams we have working on our tools and technologies and projects are actually inclusive and diverse. And that is hard. But we do know some things that work. And by know, I'm a social scientist. What I mean is there are actual scholarly studies that produce some evidence of practices that, for example, discourage women from pursuing tech careers or applying for jobs. So let me ask you a question. If I told you a couple of simple things you could do that have shown that they would remove some of the social barriers to women pursuing tech careers, would you be willing to do them? I'm looking for people to nod their heads. Thank you. All right, here goes. First, don't be this guy. Do not be this guy. Don't share advice like this. Don't joke like this. Don't talk like this. This is honestly some of the most horrendous advice I've ever seen, and not just about coding. I'm pretty certain that this is advice that is written by and shared by people who have a blind spot about the fact that real women have to worry about being doxxed by violent psychopaths just for being on the internet. Women have to worry about being stalked, attacked, and killed for ignoring the advances of strangers or for confronting catcallers. Queer and trans people are overwhelmingly more likely to be victims of violent crimes. So using, even in jest, the specter of a violent psychopath to encourage good coding practices is not just a crappy thing to do, but it also reinforces a culture that is hostile to women and to other marginalized groups. So don't be this guy. All right, I know we don't want to admit it, those of us who aren't this guy, but technology has a culture problem, even in libraries, right? So remember the search results for tech worker, right? They reflect the predominant image of who works in technologies. So aside from not being this guy, what are some other ways we can make technology more inclusive? I'm going to talk about 3 ways. We need to change the image of the tech guy. We need to change the work environment. And we need to watch our language, but not in the way you might think. So first, let's talk about the tech guy image, because the Star Trek one's going to get me in trouble. So some colleagues of mine at Stanford, 2 sociologists, Alison Wynn and Shelley Carell, they've done some really interesting work looking at how well people who are already working and succeeding in technology jobs in Silicon Valley feel that they match the cultural traits and stereotypes of a successful tech worker. And then they've looked at how that sense of a match, or in the case of most women, that sense of a mismatch, affects a bunch of outcomes, right? So first they developed a composite scale based on how tech workers, and again, they surveyed women and men who were successful tech careers in Silicon Valley, right? And so they surveyed them and they asked them to come up with some adjectives to describe a generic successful tech worker, right? Not too surprising, the stereotype that emerged was masculine, obsessive, assertive, cool, geeky, young, and this wasn't an adjective, but working long hours, right? So this is a tech guy stereotype that is widespread, well-known, probably doesn't sound too unfamiliar to most of you, right? And of course, not too surprisingly, their data showed that the women are significantly less likely than their male counterparts to view themselves as fitting that cultural image of a successful tech worker. But where it gets really interesting is that that mismatch, that sense of not fitting the cultural image, has consequences. The women who are less likely to feel they fit the image of a successful tech worker are also less likely to identify with the tech field. They're more likely to consider leaving the tech field for another career. They're also less likely to report positive treatment from their supervisors. Now remember, this sample was men and women who are currently working in tech jobs in Silicon Valley. So successful women in tech see themselves as not fitting in, and as a result, they're leaving the field, right? So the bottom line here is that cultural fit matters, not just in the pipeline as women decide whether to major in STEM fields or to pursue tech jobs, but also among women who are currently working in technology. So we have to find ways to break down the stereotypes and the cultural images associated with tech work. All right, that brings me to Star Trek, which is somehow always the most controversial part of the talks that I give. But remember, you all said, if I could give you some evidence of things that might work, you would do it. All right, so let's get to the research, right? In this really wonderful experimental study, there's a psychologist named Sapna Cherian, and her colleagues found that women who enter a computer science environment that is decorated with objects that are stereotypically associated with the field, and the examples were Star Trek posters and video games, that women who enter an environment decorated like that are less likely to consider pursuing computer science than women who enter a computer science environment with non-stereotypical objects, such as nature or travel posters. Interestingly, these results held even when the proportion of women in the environment was equal across the 2 groups, right? So even in an environment where it was mostly women, if the decorations were stereotypically male and geeky and Star Trek-y, women were less likely to want to pursue careers in computer science, right? So the Star Trek posters and the sort of other seemingly neutral, nerdy paraphernalia that we use to decorate our communal tech spaces serve to deter women. And I expect some of it deters men from marginalized groups as well. So I know some of you are thinking, but I like my Star Trek posters, right? But I guess what I hope is that your commitment to diversity wins out over your devotion to your Star Trek posters. Because increasing the number of women in tech is hard. And we have very little research to guide us. But we do know that the Star Trek stuff makes tech work less appealing to women. All right, so finally, we gotta watch our language. I'm the last that's not what I mean, and I'm the last person to make that kind of a language caution. But research does show that certain words in job ads discourage women from applying. So research shows that women are less likely to apply for engineering and programming jobs when those ads have stereotypically masculine words like competitive or dominate. Women are less likely to apply, and they're more likely to feel that, because they're more likely to feel that they wouldn't fit in or belong when those words are part of the job description. Again, this is a case where technology can help. There are text analysis programs that can tell you if you're using gendered language in your job ads and can suggest more neutral language. But again, this just points to the fact that if we want our technology to work towards diversity, inclusion, and equity, we have to be explicit and intervene and design it to explicitly do so. So that's one of the lessons learned by a set of researchers who trained a machine learning algorithm on Google News articles, then asked the algorithm to complete this analogy. Man is to computer programmer as woman is to X. The algorithm came back with the answer, homemaker. In fact, they then followed up and asked it to generate a large number of sort of he is to X as she is to Y analogies. And the algorithm came back with plenty more stereotypes. He is to doctor as she is to nurse. He is to brilliant as she is to lovely. He is to pharmaceuticals as she is to cosmetics. Yeah, wow. So now, of course, the corpus of text that the machine learning algorithm learned on was itself biased and filled with stereotypes, right? But again, there are ways to de-bias that system using a combination of human intervention and technology. And in this case, the researchers flagged associations the algorithm had made that were gendered and sexist and added code instructing the algorithm to remove those associations. So the algorithm itself was taught to recognize and remove bias. Okay, so I started off talking with this notion that libraries aren't neutral, technology is not neutral, and I've talked about lots of examples of technologies that aren't neutral, either in their design, their execution, or both. And I've offered some research to help bring more diversity to our library technology teams in the hope that more diverse and inclusive teams building our technologies will lead to design choices that favor social equity and justice. But let me be really clear. I don't think that just increasing the percentage of women and men of color in our technology departments is some magic bullet. And I don't think we need to wait until we're more diverse to start thinking about how to leverage our technology work to promote social justice. I do think we need to increase diversity in our libraries, in technology, and throughout the profession. But numbers aren't the only answer. What I have is some general ideas about how we might build library technologies for social justice. And I'm going to share them kind of quickly and at a broad level, because really what I want is for us to have a discussion about it and share with each other some ideas we might have. So first, I think we need to consciously think about social justice principles and try to build them into every step of our work. And for me, those principles are feminist principles. They're principles like transparency, participation, agency, embodiment. I think we also need to ask who is missing from our work, or from the personas we develop as we design products, right? And if the answer is, for example, women, we need to dig deeper and ask which women. We need to be intersectional in our thinking. Because too often we think that adding white women to the mix fixes our diversity problem. And if we really want to work on projects that promote social justice in our communities, then we need to talk to our most marginalized community members. Now, in my institution, that would be the racial and ethnic identity student groups. That would be queer and trans students. That would be Muslim students. If we reach out to these groups specifically, try to find out what they need, where they're struggling, what help they might need in the library and more generally at our institutions, we might realize that there are technology projects and solutions that could help. And in all of our work, I think we need to get closer. I think we get closer to social justice the more we practice the art of truly listening to each other and to our communities. I also want to consider that we should promote an ethic of care and empathy. And this is something that two of my very favorite humanists have recently written about. So Bethany Novisky, the executive director of the Digital Library Federation, wrote about this in a piece titled On Capacity and Care. And just this weekend, Kathleen Fitzpatrick, the president of the Modern Language Association, the MLA, wrote about a new project that she's working on called Generous Thinking. And I recommend both of those pieces to you. So in that spirit of listening, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I want to hear from you. I hope that you'll all feel free to say whatever you want, to make comments of all kinds. And I'm not Alex Trebek, so no need to phrase it in form of a question. I'm happy for comments and for us to have a conversation. I don't have all the answers, so I hope you don't have all the questions. Basically, I want to listen and have us listen to each other and talk to each other. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Chris. What an exceptional way to get things off this morning, get our conference started full steam. And as Chris says, there's plenty of time for comments, questions, observations. And my understanding is that there's also a mic, so we're asking people to, because the proceedings are being streamed, to go to the mic, but I understand that there's also a mic that we can pass around as well. No, but we certainly have that mic right there, so I'm going to invite people to head to the mic just so that we don't lose it.
I can hear you.
You gave a couple of examples. First of all, you talked about the idea that the tech is always going to be political, that active and also passive work, the absence of things, is a political act. And a couple of your examples had to do with technical tools. Tools that are out there that rely as their data set on this sprawling mass of biased and racist and a data set which embodies values that we would like to combat.
That's a very diplomatic way of saying it. Thank you. That was great.
But the idea of addressing our data sets, all of our data sets, according to algorithms that privilege sort of, this way of saying this, that that privilege traditions, conventions, the idea that the density of the data set has a value to the searcher, right? Let's look for the most popular hits. Let's look for where the trends are. Let's look for, right? And this seems to me to be a search value that has become very rapidly entrenched. And I'll admit to my biases. I'm a cataloger, and I think of, I know that the Library of Congress subject headings have their issues, but the idea of the endeavor is to try to map the world in some sort of, let's say for the sake of argument, neutral, descriptive, objective way, right? But we have ceded that ground, it seems to me. We've ceded that ground in deference to this idea of searching as being what's hot, what's trendy, what have other people done, what's the state of my field so that I can fit in, right? All of these sorts of things are values that are entrenched in the way that we're dealing with the data, values that are entrenched in what vendors expect us to want, values that are entrenched in our ideas of information literacy instruction, right? We're not going to be the monolithic, the authority that comes down from on high and says, this is the way we structure our data, and now learn how to understand how that works and engage with the data. No, we have taken a much more passive stance and said, we will come to you. But we are coming to, right? We are coming to that data set. Our population is in a particular moment, in a particular sort of, it has its values. By coming to them, I feel that we reinforce those values. And I'm just wondering whether you've thought or engaged in this sort of dynamic, what are our options? What can we do?
Wow, that's such a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. And I have thought a little bit about it, but I suspect that there are people in the room who've thought about it longer and harder than I have. I think there are a couple of things, and I'm so glad that you brought up cataloging and information literacy, right? Because I think those are two key places where we can intervene. When I talk about feminist values of transparency, for example, I think exposing our users to this fact, to what you just talked about, the fact that if we base, if we let them base their decisions on what's most popular, what's most heavily used, then I think we owe it to them to expose to them the fact that that is a racist algorithm, that is a sexist algorithm, one of the ways I've talked about this, and I'm blanking on the name of the talk, but it was a talk I gave at the Boston Library Consortium right after so it must have been in the spring of 2015. It was Feminism in the Future of Collections, or Feminism in Collections, or something like that. And I talked about how even things like which books get reviewed, right, in all of those objective, authoritative literary review magazines is really, really incredibly biased. In 2015, the New York Times Summer Reading List, for example, achieved peak whiteness, 100% white authors, right? And yet we as librarians sometimes will say, that those are the sources we use to make collection decisions, for example, right? And those are not neutral places. So I think there's an information literacy aspect to it. I think if we got a bunch of us who are really committed to this together in a room, we could come up with some really creative ideas for ways to sort of disrupt that popularity index, that, in the social scientists, right, I used to do a lot of survey data, and you'd always try to have a diverse population that's represented, but there are certain populations that are hard to survey, and so we'd weight the sample. could we weight the sample of our collections in such a way that we really do highlight works by and about marginalized peoples? I don't know. But I think I'm going to stop answering because I don't think I have all the answers to that. I think it's the question we need to ask, though. And I think if we get a bunch of smart, committed people in the room, we'll come up with some interesting ideas. I do think education and transparency is part of it.
Thanks very
Oh, okay. I'm hobbit-sized. And I'm using the cultured language that you warned us about.
I think I'm the only librarian on the planet who's actually never read any of those books. Yes, we'll talk later.
Are you sure you guys should be here?
I know, right?
Oh, boo. No, I'll take that. That's a boo. Related to the last question, but maybe a little bit more specific, I work in a public library, and for our digital collections, we often rely not on our own in-house tools, but through vendors and proprietary sort of options. And they've, I don't want to say got us over a barrel, but we only have so many to choose from. How do you negotiate with them about priorities like social justice-based, issues, and maybe open that up to the more academic sort of institutions in the room? How have your relationships gone with that, regards to that, and how do you start that conversation with them? As like a client, I guess. I guess you're paying them. I don't know.
No, I think that's a great question, and I really do want to hear answers from others. But I will say that we've started doing that a little bit at as much as we can. And of course, in negotiations with vendors, there's a power imbalance that doesn't favor us usually. But I will say one of the things that I will talk about one one recent success case at MIT. So we're working with a product called YEWNO, YEWNO. Look it up. It's a really cool sort of semantic visual search tool that does word mapping, and it's very cool. It's a whole different way of searching, right? And it's a startup. It's kind of new. It's in beta. We're testing it. They wanted to test it at MIT, so we've got this privilege of a name behind us. And they had started working on it back at Stanford, so I knew the folks. And when they were getting ready to debut it at MIT, I said, look, it's important to us. Transparency is important to us. So somewhere clearly on this tool, you need to show what sources are being searched, right? It's a small thing, but it helps our users know what it is they're searching. And she said, oh, people care about that? It's like, we care about that. So they put it in there. It's not as prominent, and we're working on it. But so I think there are ways we can push back and sort of think about what are our values, what are ways that we want these tools to work and be more transparent, more, whatever. And we can start by asking. If we get turned down, then we have to go to a next step. But we can start by asking. I also think that we need more projects like Hydra in a Box, where, because open source software, I think, where we can control things is obviously easier to inject our values into that than the off-the-shelf software we get from vendors, but it's often hard to implement, right? And so my understanding of the Hydra in a Box project, and here I'm way out of my league in terms of expertise on this, is that it really is an attempt to provide that kind of software in a much easier to implement way. So if there's someone here from that more familiar with that project, they could talk about it.
Thank you. And again, I apologize for my insensitive joke, sincerely.
That's an interesting example. This microphone has been set up for the height that most people have. Thank you very much for giving us this time. It's I find it somehow rare and very constructive to see somebody very trained and who has thought of these matters at length, because they are so very difficult. And you touch on a couple of subjects that I think about frequently, such as humor, language, and the relationship between the environment and the individual. I'm a little bit nervous here. I don't, I don't often speak in front of people. You mentioned a few words that discourage women from following technology careers or jobs, and one of those I had a little bit of trouble with, competitive. I was thinking, so why is competitive a male-associated word? Like, shouldn't everybody, I mean, in a sense, we are all competing. In a sense, we are all collaborating. So I started thinking about the actual virtues of competition. Is it just something that we should eliminate? Should we just always work cooperatively? But then I thought that at its core, people who challenge themselves, they're competing with their own selves. It's in the modern world, for those of us who are a certain level of privilege, you don't have to try that hard to put a roof over your head and food on the table. Just, I'm talking you yourself, not a family, just by yourself. But that's not what people do. People, go for families, for careers. They'll, undertake artistic endeavors. So, in that sense, like, I don't know, should we take the word out of the job ad, or should we, give the word back to everybody where it belongs?
Boy, that is such a great question, and I mean it's a question that goes beyond just job ads for tech workers, and it goes beyond just the word competitive, right? Do we try to, and quite frankly, that's how many of you are familiar with Sheryl Sandberg's work, Lean In? Okay, I'll own up to my biases right away. I'm not a fan of, there's all kinds of critique of that work. But I mean, essentially that's what she's suggesting in Lean In is, women should lean into being competitive and should lean into being assertive and dominant and should become more like men in the workplace, basically, and claim that seat at the table. I come from a feminist tradition, an intersexual feminist tradition, a queer theory tradition that says break the table and build a new one, or maybe build something that's not a table, right? And so, it's really this sort of perennial philosophical question that you bring up, which I love to go to that level, right? Which is, do you sort of concede the world you live in and prepare everyone equally to succeed in that world? Or do you take what I think is the social justice perspective, which says change the world? So my perspective would be, we know if we know from research that those words discourage people. And I think that they probably, and this is a problem with the research often just looks at gender and usually doesn't have enough women of color in the sample, so they really are just looking at white women. But my hypothesis for that research is that there are certain cultures that also find men and women who also find the words like competitive and dominate to be a turnoff, right? So if we know that, I say we drop the words and stop trying to change people's association with them, but we actually, on the other hand, on the way in this morning, I talked to, Leslie and I were talking about our Fitbits. I hope it's okay if I got one recently because I'm really competitive, but I'm trying to channel my competition to, as you said, my competition with myself, right? So I think that there are ways that we can do a little bit of both, but I think right now we're in this moment where if we know something is working against our own aims, we have to change the way we're doing business, and so I think we have to drop the words. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
It's hard for a lot of people to get, you can be kind of squashed in the middle of these long rows. That wasn't too hard. Thanks, Karen. I'll hand it over.
All right, sounds good. Hi, thank you. I thought that talk was great.
Thank you.
It really made me do a lot of thinking. So if I left this conference now, I would be totally happy. So,
But
one of-
don't leave. There's good stuff coming.
No, I paid a lot of money, so I'm here. One of the ideas that I really like is the idea of coding with empathy. But I get a little bit of cognitive dissonance when I hear that because I don't know how that actually works. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. Like, how would I take this back and say, let's code with empathy, and then do it?
Oh man, I was so afraid someone was going to ask me that question. And I haven't written a line of code in probably over 25 years. So I'm probably the least qualified person to answer that question. But I'll try anyway, of course, because that's why you put me in front of the podium. First thing I'd say is please, I really encourage everyone to go and read almost everything that Bethany Nowitzki has ever written on this topic. And she is somebody who codes and is much closer to the technology work than I am, but is also comes at it from a deeply humanist perspective. I also think, again, follow Kathleen Fitzpatrick's piece on generous thinking is sort of her first piece of a new project. And for those of you who don't know, Kathleen Fitzpatrick sort of famously wrote her last book, Planned Obsolescence, online and in public, right? So she's going to write this next book, Generous Thinking, online and in public. And I think there might be clues in there because these are two women who are much smarter than me on how you code with empathy. But I think it is a matter of thinking about putting yourself in the shoes of the user, right? And thinking about what this code will do, and thinking about, for those of us who do have identities that put us in privileged groups, thinking about what does what this code do feel like to somebody who's not like me. And that's not a thing I think we ask developers to do very often. I think some of what we do, we're starting there, the move towards developing personas, I think is a nod towards that, towards empathizing with these personas. So I think those have to be intentionally diverse and include our most marginalized users. That's about all, again, we've reached sort of way beyond the limits of my expertise, so maybe others can think about ways to code with empathy. It's a great question.
I'd be happy to pass anybody the mic who would be interested. There's a little track.
Thanks. As a linguist, I just want to say that I appreciate your approach to those words and sort of being empirical about it, so thank you for that. To give a sort of small but I think important example of vendors and terminology, I'm at an independent high school in Massachusetts, and we all know subject access to fiction is not the best, so we are tagging books in our library catalog to sort of try to highlight diverse books and make it easier for people to find them. So we have the big 8 identifiers: age, religion, ability, sexuality, gender, all those things. And one day I went to tag the first novel featuring lesbian characters and found that lesbian was a stop word in our in our catalog vendors list of tags.
Wow.
So I had to get on the phone with them right away and kind of, I don't think they got it though. They said, "Oh, we can change that for you." And I said, "I want you to change that for everyone." So we are now researching new ILS.
Although you'd end up with all the lesbians at your library, which is not,
Right. Yeah, but anyhow, I just thought I'd share that as one example of what
That's a
we're coming
great
up with.
story.
And
That's a great example.
And how would we know? I mean, if I hadn't tried it.
Yeah. That's a great example. Thank you.
Can I pass the mic?
Get one way up in the back.
I actually just want you to go back one slide that has the titles and the author of those.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I don't really have that was my question.
I did try to include references on most of my slides, and I'll make those available for folks who weren't snapping pictures or writing them down. Because I don't know if you noticed, but almost everything I say is based on work other people did. So, you know.
I'm scanning to see if anybody has got their.
I was actually wondering if you could maybe widen the context on this a little bit and speak a little more about how you see these ideas.
Can you raise your?
applying-
I can't. Oh, there you are.
Oh,
Okay.
up here.
It's really hard to tell who's got the
How
mic
you see these
now.
ideas applying to, say, like public libraries and special libraries as well, because, I mean, a lot of lib tech is heavily weighted towards academic libraries. And these are all interesting ideas, but, I mean, I work for the Metropolitan New York Library Council in New York, and we basically are responsible for providing services to all libraries except probably for NYPL. You know, in New York City and in Westchester. So we serve a broad range of libraries, and these are all interesting ideas, but I'd like to see them in a slightly wider context.
Yeah, I would too. I mean, and I think that's a great question. Also one that I'm not super qualified to answer. My whole library career has been at Stanford University Libraries and now at MIT. So you know, that's where my blinders and my bias come. You know, what I hope is that people at libraries that aren't, you know, let's face it, Stanford and MIT have a lot of cachet, just the names, right? These are elite private U.S. universities, right? What I hope is that if places like Stanford and MIT and my colleagues elsewhere start being very intentional and very public about things, that places at other libraries that don't have that name recognition can point to us and say, MIT's doing it, we can do it. But honestly, I'll ask your peers here who are at public libraries and special libraries to sort of bring that context to it, because I'm not qualified. I think it's important, and I'd love to have those conversations. I'd love to learn.
Enjoyed your presentation and actually some of the questions subsequently. What I recall in the early days of the web, those of us that worked in libraries entertained some quaint ideas like that, you know, the library would be the gateway to all this wonderful information out there, and that, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we could catalog the entire internet? And I think we've moved beyond that, and I guess that's what I see as the dilemma. We're dealing with data sets, as one of the questions earlier referred to, that are much, much larger than, well, not even just academic library spheres, but the entire library or information science sphere. And even if a whole bunch of bright, creative people in the library world did all of these things to make that a much more, inclusive or neutral environment, would it be enough, for example, to offset the tweets, say, from a particularly prominent U.S. politician like Donald Trump, in terms of just how the massive data sets work out there and what drives things that move up in a Google search, for example?
Well, no, I mean, I don't. I mean, would that librarians could topple Donald Trump? I mean, I like that vision. Speaking of not neutral. But no, I mean, I don't think that we, I think we have to concentrate on those things that we have some jurisdiction over, right? So that is our own tools and technologies that we employ and that we use and that we create. But it also is the information that we put out into the web. And so, at MIT, one of our commitments as a library is to be an open global platform. And so we're really looking at and hat tip to Roy's colleague, Lorcan Dempsey, for this idea. We're looking at our collections as an inside-out collection. We're sort of really taking to heart the idea that libraries need to kind of move from this model of sort of going out and acquiring a bunch of stuff from outside my university and bringing it in and then giving it to the people at my university. And instead, taking the stuff produced at my university and of my university and providing it openly to the world, right? And the more of that we provide, the more conscious we are of sort of the biases in that. And for example, we're working to start aggressively collecting and digitizing the history of women at MIT, right? And once you get the history of women at MIT, you've got a pretty good corner of the market on the history of women in technology and science. And so that will attract other, right? So right now you start looking at the history of women, of technology and science, and so much of it obscures the contributions of women. So there's something we can do to correct for that. That may not be a super satisfying answer to your question, but maybe others have other responses.
Does anybody have another response or another question? We're getting down to the last couple of questions at this point.
Okay, good.
Hi, I was wondering if you could speak more about, I guess, specific strategies for within our own organizations who want to become more inclusive but have blind spots in our organizational makeup. For example, my university serves a particularly large Aboriginal community, but we're all white in the library. So we want to make ourselves more inclusive, but we do have those implicit blind spots, and I was wondering if you have any specific strategies for getting around that.
Sure. I have some. I mean, one, I think, since we're talking about the U.S. presidential election, I mean, I think it's brilliant that on one side of that debate, there's an acknowledgement that we all have implicit bias. And so, I mean, I think that implicit bias training for staff is really, really important. I also think doing that sort of publicly and transparently so that your community knows that you're trying to acknowledge and mitigate your blind spots and your biases. I think that can be really powerful. I think also really going out and talking to your communities, not to teach them what you have to offer, but to learn and listen to what they have to offer and what you need to learn. So I think it's often about relationships with the community. And sometimes I get the question about sort of how do I do this kind of work in if it's not a priority in my organization. Okay, and I don't know if that's what you're asking. I know nothing about, but some people ask that. People are saying, and I think connecting it to serving your community is a way to connect it to what are strategic objectives for every library I know, right? And so to serve your community, you have to understand that community and learn from them. So I think trying to go to those communities, again, in some folks are starting to talk about in terms of a stance of cultural humility. So it's not just cultural sensitivity, it's cultural humility. And again, that sort of ethic of listening and caring, I think, is really important.
Last one to Roy.
Oh man, the pressure. Chris, great talk as always. And I agree we have a long way to go, but I also want to point out that there has been some little bit of progress. So for example, 10 years ago, I was at the first Code for Lib conference. There were maybe 80 people there. I think there were 5 women, maybe. So there's been progress there. We have much better attendance at Code for Lib. And looking around the room at this library technology conference, I'm very encouraged.
Yep.
How many women are here? We need more, clearly, more ethnic diversity.
Yep.
But there has been some progress, and we are on the right road, I think. So the suggestions you made are excellent ones, and we have to really take those to heart and build on the progress we've been able to make over the last 10 years or so.
I think that's a great place to end. Thanks, Roy. Thank you all.